Welcome back to this week's Storyline tutorial. We're glad you're here and ready to keep learning. In our last video, we explored the user interface panels. If you missed it or want a quick refresher, you'll find a link in the description below. In this lesson, we'll start diving into those panels one by one, beginning with the timeline, your key tool for controlling how everything flows on a slide. As we mentioned in the User Interface Panels video, the timeline is located at the bottom of the screen, just below the slide content area. If you don't see it, you probably have the Notes panel or the States panel selected instead. Just make sure the Timeline tab is selected and highlighted in blue, so you know you're in the right place. Now, before we dive deeper, I want to point out something new in this video. You're going to see two icons appear from time to time, a gear icon and an idea icon. The gear icon is there to show you how to use the tool or feature we're talking about. The idea icon, on the other hand, will call out a tip you can use in your programming or debugging. These are little cues designed to help you get the most out of each step as we move along. And here's a tip for you right up front. When you're not sure why the timeline isn't visible, don't waste time thinking it's broken. Check the tabs along the bottom. Most of the time, you'll find the Notes or States panel is open, and all you need to do is click back on Timeline to bring it up. When you open the Timeline panel, you'll notice it's divided into two sections. On the right is the actual timeline itself. That's where you can see when objects appear and disappear on the slide. On the left are three columns that control each object: visibility, editing, and titles. Let's walk through this section. The first column uses little eyeball icons to show visibility. If the eyeball is solid, the item is visible to both you and the learner. If it looks lighter or faded, that means it's hidden. For example, text box 1 is showing a lighter gray eyeball, which makes it harder to see, and that's Storyline's way of telling you the object is turned off. This applies to everything in the timeline, even audio. At the very top of the column, you'll see a master eyeball that can toggle visibility for all items at once. The second column has the padlock icon, and this one's all about control. If it's unlocked, you can move that object wherever you want, shift its position on the slide, drag it earlier or later in the timeline, or add and change animations. But if you lock it, the object is frozen in place. You can't nudge it, slide its timing, or tweak effects until you unlock it again. This is especially useful for background images, logos, or anything you don't want moved while you're working. So, how do you know if the item is locked or not? If you see the padlock icon for that object, then the item is locked and you can't edit any of its features. Finally, just like the visibility column, there's a master padlock at the top that locks or unlocks everything at once. The third column shows the object titles. By default, Storyline names them things like Picture 1, Text Box, or Text Box 1. That's fine when you only have a few items, but once a slide fills up, it becomes very hard to tell which item is which. The best habit you can build is renaming objects as soon as you insert them. Use names that make sense to you and to anyone else who might open the project later. For example, instead of Picture 1, I might call it Image, Storyline Screenshot. You don't have to follow my exact format, but keep it clear and consistent. It will save you time and frustration later. Now, here are a couple of tips for putting this into practice. Visibility and locking may look similar, but they solve very different problems. Hiding an object with the eyeball means it won't show up at all. You and the learner won't see it. And if it's audio, you won't hear it either. Locking, on the other hand, doesn't hide the object. It just prevents you from editing or moving it. Think of visibility as controlling what the learner experiences, and locking as protecting your layout while you build. Here's a real-world example. If you're testing a slide and don't want the background music playing on repeat, hide the audio track using the eyeball. But if you've got a logo in the corner that should never shift, lock it with the padlock. Two tools, two different purposes. And one last troubleshooting tip: if something isn't showing up when you preview your slide, whether it's an image, text, or audio, the first thing to check is the visibility column. More often than not, you simply forgot to turn it back on. At the bottom of the left section, you'll find a set of icons that control how you interact with the timeline. Moving from left to right, there's a play pause button, a stop button, a triangle, a slider, two more triangles, and finally a digital clock. The play, pause, and stop buttons work together to let you preview how the slide is programmed directly inside slide view. This is different from the full preview mode. Preview mode shows you the complete learner experience, including the player and navigation controls. The play, pause, and stop buttons are a developer tool. They allow you to start the timeline, pause it, stop it, and make adjustments without switching modes. When you hit pause, the timeline freezes right where it is, and when you hit play again, it continues from that same point. The stop button, on the other hand, halts the timeline completely and resets it back to the beginning. Next, the triangle, slider, and two mountain-shaped icons all work together to control the zoom level of the timeline. Drag the slider to the right and you'll zoom in, which spaces out the increments on the timeline and gives you more detailed control over exactly when objects appear or animate. Drag it back to the left and you zoom out, which makes it easier to see the bigger picture of the entire slide. Finally, the digital clock displays the total length of the slide. This makes it easy to know how long the timeline runs from start to finish. One more feature to point out here is the border between the left section and the timeline. You can grab this divider and drag it left or right to adjust the width of the left panel. Expanding it gives you more space to read longer object names, while contracting it frees up more room to view the timeline itself. Here's how you might use these tools in practice. If you're adjusting timing for animations or audio and things feel too cramped, zoom in with the slider so you can line everything up with more precision. Then, when you want to step back and see how your objects fit together, zoom back out. A common example is syncing narration with bullet point entrances. Zooming in helps you match each bullet with the right moment in the audio, then zooming back out lets you check the overall flow of the slide. And if you're working on a slide that has lots of objects with long names, expanding the left panel can make it easier to quickly spot the right one before you make changes. Here's a troubleshooting tip. If you're previewing your slide and something doesn't seem to trigger when you expect, try using the play, pause, and stop controls instead of the full preview. They give you a clearer view of exactly where items fall on the timeline, which makes it easier to spot if an animation or audio clip is just a little out of place. Let's move now to the timeline itself. You may have already noticed, but the way you know which object you're working on is that it will be highlighted in blue with white text, while the other objects appear in a lighter gray with dark gray text. Each row in the timeline includes an icon and an identifier to help you know what you're looking at. The icon tells you the type of object. For example, a text box looks like a little document, an image looks like a picture icon, and a shape is represented by its outline. Next to the icon, the identifier gives you more detail that complements the title shown in the left section. For example, a picture row will usually display the file name, an audio track will show the sound wave, and a text box will display the actual words from that box. You may also notice small shaded triangles on an object's bar in the timeline. These represent entrance and exit animations. A triangle at the beginning of the bar means the object has an entrance animation, while a triangle at the end shows it has an exit animation. This makes it easy to see at a glance which objects animate onto or off of the slide, and how long those animations will occur. On the far right of the timeline, you may see a small arrow pointing to the right. This arrow means the object is programmed to appear all the way to the end of the slide. If you don't see the arrow, then the object has a fixed length of time. That distinction matters. If an object runs until the end of the slide, you can still adjust the overall slide length. But if an object has a fixed duration, then the slide will always be at least as long as that object. We mentioned earlier that you can zoom in and out of the timeline using the slider in the left section. You can also do this directly in the timeline itself. Place your cursor at the top of the timeline where the time increments appear, then roll your mouse wheel to zoom in or out. You'll also notice the playhead, shown as a blue down-pointing triangle at the top of the timeline with a vertical blue line extending down through the objects. The playhead marks the current position on the timeline. In other words, it shows you the exact moment you're looking at in the slide. Before we wrap up this section, there's one more feature worth pointing out: the two small windows in the upper right corner of the panel. Selecting this icon lets you undock the timeline panel and move it somewhere else, even onto a second monitor. Back in the User Interface Panels video, we talked about how this can give you more room in the content area, but another benefit is that once a panel is undocked, you can resize it however you like. Now that you know what the highlights, icons, markers, and arrows represent, and you've seen how features like zooming, the playhead, and undocking work, The whole panel becomes much easier to follow. With these basics in place, you'll always have a clear picture of what's happening on your slide at any given moment. Now that we've explored what the timeline shows, let's talk about how to use it to bring your slide to life. Think of the timeline as your workspace checklist. Everything on your slide is listed here, and the order from top to bottom determines what shows in front of what. So if a shape and a text box overlap, the one higher in the list will appear on top. In this example, the two rectangles sit above the text box, which means if they're in the same spot, you'll see the shapes covering the text. Audio tracks work a little differently. They don't stack in front or behind other items. If you have more than one, they'll all play together at whatever volume you've set. To keep things organized, I like to drag all my audio tracks down to the bottom of the timeline. That way, I can focus on the visuals while still knowing exactly where the narration sits when I'm syncing everything together. And if you ever want to change which item appears in front or behind, just drag it up or down in the list. When you add something new to your slide, Storyline places it right where the playhead is sitting. By default, that new object stays visible until the end of the slide. The only exception is audio, since it only lasts as long as the sound file. If your slide is shorter than the audio, Storyline automatically extends it to match. If the audio ends earlier, it simply finishes and the rest of the slide continues. You can also control the total length of the slide yourself. Hover over the gray bar at the very end of the timeline. When the cursor changes to a double line, click and drag left or right to make the slide shorter or longer. Let's take a quick look at how that works. You can do the same thing for any object on the timeline. Move your cursor to the start or end of its bar until you see the double arrow. Then drag left or right to adjust when it appears and disappears. Now, watch closely as we adjust this image again. Notice how the small arrow that used to show appear until end of slide disappears once we shorten it. That's Storyline's way of showing the object now has its own specific end time. You can also jump the playhead to any specific moment by clicking directly in the timescale at the top of the timeline. That's where the seconds are displayed. It's a quick way to preview exactly when something will appear or to line up animations with your narration. And if you ever need to move several items together, hold Ctrl or Shift to select them as a group. You can shift them, align their timing, or add animations all at once. There's another way to work with the timeline by using the right mouse button instead of the left. When you do that, Storyline gives you a quick menu of extra options. What shows up depends on whether you've selected an object or not. Let's try it without anything selected. When I right-click in an empty area of the timeline, a small menu appears. You'll see options like Create Cue Point at Playhead, Fit Timeline to Longest Object, and Reset Timeline to Default. Each one helps you manage timing a little differently. If I choose Create Cue Point at Playhead, Storyline drops a small marker right where the playhead sits. Think of a cue point as a bookmark in time, a spot you can come back to or use to trigger something specific, like an animation or an audio effect. Earlier, we talked about aligning objects to the playhead. That works, but if you move your timing later, you have to go back and nudge everything again. Cue points make that much easier. You can connect animations or triggers directly to the cue point itself, and if the timing changes later, you just move the cue point. Everything linked to it follows automatically. We'll look deeper at cue points when we get to the trigger panel later in this series. Another option is Fit Timeline to Longest Object. This one's handy when you've been editing for a while and your slide ends up longer than it needs to be. When you select it, Storyline checks every object on the timeline and adjusts the slide's length so it ends exactly where your longest object ends. It's a quick cleanup tool, perfect for trimming that extra space that can sneak in after recording narration or shifting visuals around. And if you ever want to start fresh, there's Reset Timeline to Default. That returns your slide to the original default length you set for your project, usually a few seconds, and pulls all your objects back within that range. It's a fast way to reset timing if you've been experimenting or want to rebuild the pacing from scratch. Now, let's see what happens when we right-click an object in the timeline instead of an empty area. This time, the menu is quite a bit longer. You'll see options such as cut, copy, paste, rename, bring to front, send to back, create cue point at playhead, alignment, show until end, show always, timing, and accessibility. Some of these are standard Windows tools, so we won't spend time on things like cut, copy, or paste. Instead, let's focus on the options that are part of Storyline's own functionality, the ones that help you actually program and control what happens on your slide. If you remember from earlier, we showed that you can rename an object by double-clicking its name in the left column of the timeline. This option does the same thing. It just gives you another way to rename the selected item by right-clicking and choosing Rename. Next are Bring to Front and Send to Back. These control which items appear in front of others. The same idea we talked about when rearranging objects in the timeline list. Choosing Bring to Front moves that object all the way to the top of the order, so it appears above everything else. If you only need to move it up one level, choose Bring Forward. Send to Back and Send Backward do the opposite. They lower the object's visual priority so it appears behind other items. The next three, Create Cue Point at Playhead, Fit Timeline to Longest Object, and Reset Timeline to Default, work exactly the same here as they did when we right-clicked an empty area. Let's talk about alignment. This option helps you line things up precisely between your object and the playhead. You'll probably use Align Object to Playhead most often. That's when you've positioned the playhead where you want something to appear and you're ready to line it up perfectly. The other two options flip that relationship. Align Playhead to Object Start jumps the playhead to where that object begins. Align Playhead to Object End moves it to where the object leaves the slide. These are small shortcuts, but they save a lot of dragging and guessing when you're syncing multiple objects. Now, you'll also see Show Until End and Show Always. You've already seen these in action with the timeline arrows. Here, you can toggle them directly from the menu. If Show Until End is checked, the arrow appears at the right edge of the object bar, meaning it stays visible until the slide finishes. If you uncheck it, that arrow disappears. Show Always works the same way, but controls the start of the object. When it's selected, a left-facing arrow appears at the beginning of the bar, meaning the object is visible from the very start of the slide all the way to the end. The timing option gives you even finer control. Instead of dragging bars on the timeline, you can type in exact numbers for when the object should appear and how long it should stay visible, down to hundredths of a second. If you like precision, this is the tool for you. You'll also see checkboxes here for Show Until End of Slide and Always Show on Slide, which work exactly the same as the options we just discussed. And finally, there's accessibility. This one's important. It opens a window where you can add alt text, descriptions, and other details that make your course more inclusive for every learner. Accessibility isn't just a checkbox, it's how we make sure everyone can interact with the same content in meaningful ways. That's a quick walkthrough of what happens when you right-click an object on the timeline. Lots of familiar tools, but a few really powerful shortcuts once you know where to look. Now that you've seen how the timeline works, let's wrap up with a few ways to make it work for you. The first thing to remember is that the timeline isn't just a visual reference, it's your command center. If something doesn't look right on your slide, 9 times out of 10, the answer's hiding somewhere down here. Try getting comfortable moving the playhead around while you work. Instead of clicking preview every time, drag the playhead back and forth and watch how your objects appear and disappear in real time. It's the fastest way to fine-tune animations or check that your narration lines up with what's happening on screen. You can also pause playback anywhere along the timeline and make small adjustments, like shifting a shape's entrance by half a second or trimming the end of a text box that lingers too long. The beauty of it is that you don't have to leave the panel. You can do nearly everything right here. If you're syncing to narration, add a cue point wherever you hear a keyword or natural pause. Then, use those cue points to anchor your object timing. It keeps things consistent, especially when you're adjusting multiple slides that share the same voiceover. Another simple trick: use the zoom control at the bottom of the panel. Zoom out when you want to see your whole slide sequence. Zoom in tight when you need precise control for quick transitions or short sound effects. If you ever lose track of where you are, click the small Fit to Timeline button, and everything snaps back into view. When you're working on complex slides, try collapsing groups you're not actively editing. This clears up space and keeps you focused on just the elements that matter right now. And if you're troubleshooting, use the eye icons to hide a few items temporarily. It's a great way to isolate one animation without deleting anything. And finally, don't be afraid to preview often. Watching the slide play from start to finish is the best way to catch timing issues, especially when you've got multiple animations, layers, or audio tracks working together. That's your quick tour of the timeline's best habits. Use it often, trust what it's showing you, and let it be your guide for timing, order, and polish. Once you get comfortable here, the rest of Storyline starts to click into place. Here we see Dixie and Fireball engaging in some creative collaboration, otherwise known as wrestling on company time. Thank you for spending the last few minutes and for watching this week's video helping you to learn Articulate Storyline. We hope you found it useful and valuable. If you did, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. If there is something about Storyline you want to learn more about, please let us know in the comments. The Pug Grumble says, "Thank you and have a great day."